I thought, something's weird. And so rather than totally format the hard drive, I start looking. And there's a huge amount of deleted files here. And he just went right into, this is the way it's going to be. You will settle for this amount, or I'm going to get you fired from your job. And it's such a straight-laced district, and they'll just be so embarrassed that someone is accused of, and I'll call the news outlets, and I'm going to get you fired. Allegedly, this is the last week of TikTok, so maybe I need to tell my stories. So many of you know I was married for 25 years. And while the marriage didn't last, it really did start out great. I was in love. I know he was in love with me. We ended up having 3 children, 2 who are still living. But the story I want to talk about was about 10 years into our marriage. We were having some problems and talking about ways to reconnect. My ex was a fighter pilot in the Air Force, was still working for the Air Force Reserves, but was also working for a major airline. He had a long layover in New Orleans, and he wanted me to come and stay with him for the long layover. So I got childcare and went and met him. I'd never been to New Orleans, so I was really looking forward to it. We went and had a great dinner. We went down to Bourbon Street and had a really good time. And then he started telling me he wanted to go on one of the riverboat cruises. And he had a very specific time that he wanted to go. So he kept looking at his watch and seemed really concerned about making it in time. So finally, we just go to the dock. And it's about 30 minutes before the cruise was supposed to start. And there was already a line forming, so we get in line. And we're just kind of hanging out there. And this other couple comes up behind us and they start talking to us. Now, I love to travel and I love to talk to people, especially if they're local, and just figure out their stories and talk. So I was having a great time, but my ex did not like talking to people. Even when we were back at home in a neighborhood where we knew everybody, and they had children who played with our children, and we had been to their homes for dinner. My ex, if we were taking a family walk after dinner and another family was headed towards us, he would say, don't stop and talk. Don't stop and talk. I don't want to talk to them. I don't want to stop and talk. He was almost antisocial. But anyway, this couple comes up and I'm talking to them, and all of a sudden I realize that he's very animated and talking to the guy. And I thought that was kind of strange, and thought he's really had more to drink than I thought he did. At one point, he says, I need to go to the restroom. And he leaves the line, and the guy says, oh, I need to go too, and goes with him. And I thought, well, that's kind of weird too, but I continue talking to the girl. And at one point, she gestures across the river and says, see that house over there? And it was this huge mansion. It was beautiful. It was all lit up. There was obviously some event happening there. And she said, well, we're actually going to a party over there, and you guys seem like a cool couple. Why don't you go to this party with us? And I said, oh no, this is really what he wants to do tonight, and we've planned this whole evening around this. So yeah, we're just going to do the riverboat cruise. The guys come back from the bathroom, and my ex says, hey, how's it going? And the woman says, well, I invited your wife to this party, but she says she doesn't think you want to go. And he looks across and he goes, oh, no, that sounds like fun. Let's go. I was shocked. Absolutely shocked. I couldn't have been more shocked. But I said, no, you have talked about this riverboat cruise all night. This is what we're doing. And he was kind of, really? I said, yeah. I mean, you made us change our dinner plans to do this. So I said, we're doing the cruise. So the line starts moving. We're getting on, and this couple's going with us. Like, they're walking with us. And I said, oh, are you not going to your party? And she said, oh, we're going to go on the cruise with you, and then you can go to the party with us afterwards. And at that point, I was like, hell no, I'm not doing this. I'm not going to a party with some random people that we just met in line. So my husband loves to play craps, so we migrate to the craps table, and we're standing there for a little bit, and finally I said, I'm just gonna wander around and see what else there is. And this woman goes with me, and like she is stuck to me like glue. And I just thought the whole thing was weird. So I said, I have to go to the bathroom. And yeah. And she said, I'll go with you. I said, no, I'm not feeling very well. My stomach hurts. I'd like some privacy, please. So I go into the bathroom and I stayed in there for a long time. And I finally venture out and I'm looking around and making sure I don't see her. And I find a corner, there's a fake plant, and I scooch in behind it, between it and the wall, and I sit down on the floor, and that's where I stayed for the rest of that cruise. So when the cruise docks and people are starting to disembark, I go by the door and I'm just waiting. And my ex comes up to me and he was pissed. And he said, "Where have you been? We've been looking all over for you and never, I'm not worried about you, but I've been looking all over for you." And I said, "Well, I don't feel very good. I was kind of sick. I want to go back to the hotel." And he said, "Well, no, I want to go to this party." And I said, "I don't feel well. If you want to go to the party, go, but I'm going back to the hotel." Well, he doesn't go to the party. He walks back with me to the hotel. But I got the silent treatment like you would not believe. He wouldn't even hardly walk with me. We had made plans to have this great night in the hotel and then go to brunch the next morning and then go back to the airport together. He was going to continue his trip. I was going to go on home. But he got up in the morning, he got ready to go, and he left. He left without me, left me to fend for myself to get back to the airport and get back home, which I did because I'm a big girl. And then a few days later when he came home, still the silent treatment. He was so mad that I would not go to this party. And why do you think that was? Coming up. Okay, so we had been to New Orleans. We had been invited to a party by a random couple. I said no. My ex was pissed. We're back home. And all he does is tell me what a horrible wife I am, that I don't want to work out on the marriage. And everything was horrible. Fast forward a couple of weeks. I worked from home at this point. I did a lot of contract work for some companies, but we still had just one computer that we shared, and there were issues with the computer. It was acting up. So I said, "Hey, I'm going to reformat the computer." And I used to build computers with my dad, so I knew my way around a computer. And I said, "But I need you to spend some time before you go on your next trip and save any important files because I'm going to reformat the hard drive and it's going to overwrite everything." And he spends the next 48 hours constantly up on that computer and saving files and doing his thing and telling me that he's got to get it done. So he leaves. And this is before you had really good cell phone coverage and things, but we had an 800 number that he would call whenever he wanted to call home. And usually when he was on one of his trips with the airline, he would call me once a day. Usually in the evenings, right before the kids went to bed, he'd call. He wanted to know if anything came in the mail. He'd talk to the kids real quick and then say goodnight. Well, the first day that he's gone, he's calling me every time he's got a break. Every time there's a layover, he's calling. "How's it going? How's the computer going? Did you find anything interesting?" And by day 2 of him doing this, I thought, something's weird. And so rather than totally format the hard drive, I start looking. And there's a huge amount of deleted files. For those of you who don't know, when you delete a file in the computer, it doesn't actually delete the file. It just frees up that space on the hard drive to be overwritten at some point in time. But you don't know when it's going to be overwritten because the computer, when you save a new file, it goes and looks for spots of memory that will fit this new file. So it has to be some size that's greater than the new file. So that's how the hard drive gets overwritten. That's really how those files get deleted. So I start looking, and I've done some digital forensics in my career, so I was able to open up without restoring the files. I could open them and see. And I am pretty good about looking at the metadata, and metadata on files is data about the data. And first I found a whole bunch of emails. And the emails, I could see who they were from, who they were sent to, date and timestamps, and then I could make out the text. And I started downloading the ones that looked really interesting, kind of suspicious, not thinking too much at this point. I'm just kind of formulating what might be going on, that we have all these deleted files. And then I find files from a discussion board. And I find the same email address that he's been sending emails to. He's communicating with that email address and several others, but this one in particular. And I finally find out that the discussion board, it's a group of married couples who swing. And his very first post, I started putting everything in chronological order with the discussions and then the emails that I found. And the very first post he put on this group was, my wife and I, our marriage is really stale. I'd really like to introduce her to swinging. What's the best way to do that? And he ends up talking to this one couple that it's the same email that I found in the deleted emails. So I start reading through everything with a fine-tooth comb. Oh my gosh. So he set me up. He tried to set me up. And I was like, couldn't believe it. And it's been several weeks, like 3 weeks since the New Orleans thing. And I am just, my heart and dropped and my stomach was just, it was ridiculous. It just, I could not even. And I start printing off the evidence. And then I get to emails that were after the fact with this couple about, oh, the plan didn't work. And then he starts just talking to the man. And I come across an email where there's images attached. And basically they started sharing they shared dick pics. I don't even know how else to say it. They shared dick pics. And where it left off, the most current email, which he sent right before he left on his trip, was making arrangements to meet this guy the next week. I printed everything. I had more than a ream of paper. It's worth of printouts that I confronted him with when he came home from his trip. Okay, it's getting late, so this will probably be the last update I have time to do this evening. I'll pick it up tomorrow. But we left off, I had just printed off over a ream's worth of evidence of what I had found on the computer. And when my now ex got home from the trip, I had it laying on the dining room table. He got home really late. The kids were already in bed. And he walks in the door and he fixes his nightcap that he always made. Have I mentioned he's an alcoholic? But I didn't really know it when we got married. Whole nother story. But he fixes his nightcap and he goes and he sits down at the table and he sees this big stack of paper. And he said, "What's this?" And I said, "Well, I was hoping you could tell me." And he starts reading through it. And his face gets red. His neck gets red. And he, at one point, throws everything down and starts yelling at me. How dare I spy on him? How dare I invade his privacy? And what the heck do I think I'm doing? And what a horrible wife I am. And I just sat and let him rant. And then I said, "Look, I don't know what you've got going on in your life. I don't know if you're questioning your sexuality or what." And he goes, "I only did it because you're such a horrible wife." And I said, "Here's the deal. You need to take some time to discover you. So, but you're not going to do it in the safety of our marriage. So I need you to leave. And I kicked him out. I kicked him out. We ended up being separated for 3 months. And I ended up seeing an attorney. I did everything but file. Again, we're at the 10-year mark of our marriage. 2 young children at home. We hadn't had our third yet. And I made him leave. He packed a bag that night. He was still in the Air Force Reserve. So at the base where he was doing reserve scrums, he could stay at the BOQ. He also spent some time with his dad. His dad lived in a different state. And the very sad thing about this is he would come home once a week to have dinner with the kids and tuck them in and do the bedtime thing. And the sad thing about the whole situation is the kids didn't even know. They didn't know that he wasn't living there, that he wasn't sleeping there. That's how little he was really involved in the family at that point. And it was a hard time. So I saw an attorney. I did everything but actually file for divorce. I was willing to work things out. And we didn't talk about anything or do anything. It was very status quo for the first 2 months. And then he started telling me about this captain that he was flying with and how the captain talked about his family and his children and church. And he really thought that he wanted that. And so I started telling him what it would take for me to feel comfortable for him to come back and try to work on the marriage. And again, 3 months, and he called me one Saturday, and he said, I am going to fly into the city tomorrow morning. I want to go to church with you and the kids. And I've gone to church our entire marriage. I've gone to church my entire life. I was on the worship team in my church, and the kids were very involved in the kids program, and always invited him to church. And that's my day off on Sundays. I don't want to spend it sitting in church and playing Christian. And so he would never go with us. And then all of a sudden he's like, I'm coming in and I want to go to church. And I thought, well, this is really promising. And I said, yeah, that would be great. I'm singing worship, but the kids will be sitting with the children's pastor was a real good friend of mine, he and his wife, and they would always sit with my kids in the church service until it was time to take them to children's church. And I said, so you'll come in, this is where they sit, and I'll come sit with you after worship time is over. And I saw him when he walked in, and it was a pretty large church. I would say there were probably 500 to 750 people. This was before mega churches, but it would be considered a mega church in today's society. But I saw him walk in, and the kids went on to children's church. And when I was done, I went and I sat with them and just sat the whole service. And then at the end, they did the altar call, and I had my head bowed, and I felt him get up. And he walked down the aisle, and he gave his life to Christ. And there are people who knew our story. There are people in my Bible study group who knew what I was going through. And to this day, even though we now know the end of the story is my marriage didn't survive, they would to this day say that was one of the biggest miracles they ever saw. And he gave his life to Christ. And I didn't let him come home right away. But I said, if you're willing to go to counseling, I'm willing to try and work this out. And he agreed to go to counseling. But counseling was going to be under his terms. Okay, it's getting late, so this will probably be the last update I have time to do this evening. I'll pick it up tomorrow. But we left off, I had just printed off over a ream's worth of evidence of what I had found on the computer. And when my Now, X got home from the trip. I had it laying on the dining room table. He got home really late. The kids were already in bed. And he walks in the door and he fixes his nightcap that he always made. Have I mentioned he's an alcoholic? But I didn't really know it when we got married. Whole nother story. But he fixes his nightcap and he goes and he sits down at the table and he sees this big stack of paper. And he said, "What's this?" And I said, "Well, I was hoping you could tell me." And he starts reading through it. And his face gets red. His neck gets red. And he, at one point, throws everything down and starts yelling at me. How dare I spy on him? How dare I invade his privacy? And what the heck do I think I'm doing? And what a horrible wife I am. And I just sat and let him rant. And then I said, "Look, I don't know what you've got going on in your life. I don't know if you're questioning your sexuality or what." And he goes, "I only did it because you're such a horrible wife." And I said, "Here's the deal. You need to take some time to discover you. But you're not going to do it in the safety of our marriage. So I need you to leave." And I kicked him out. I kicked him out. We ended up being separated for 3 months. And I ended up seeing an attorney. I did everything but file. Again, we're at the 10-year mark of our marriage. 2 young children at home. We hadn't had our third yet. And I made him leave. He packed a bag that night. He was still in the Air Force Reserve. So at the base where he was doing reserves from, he could stay at the BOQ. He also spent some time with his dad. His dad lived in a different state. And the very sad thing about this is he would come home once a week to have dinner with the kids and tuck them in and do the bedtime thing. And the sad thing about the whole situation is the kids didn't even know. They didn't know that he wasn't living there, that he wasn't sleeping there. That's how little he was really involved in the family at that point. And it was a hard time. So I saw an attorney. I did everything but actually file for divorce. I was willing to work things out. And we didn't talk about anything or do anything. It was very status quo for the first 2 months. And then he started telling me about this captain that he was flying with and how the captain talked about his family and his children and church. And he really thought that he wanted that. And so I started telling him what it would take for me to feel comfortable for him to come back and try to work on the marriage. And again, 3 months, and he called me one Saturday, and he said, "I am going to fly into the city tomorrow morning. I want to go to church with you and the kids." And I've gone to church our entire marriage. I've gone to church my entire life. I was on the worship team in my church, and the kids were very involved in the kids program, and always invited him to church. And that's my day off on Sundays. I don't want to spend it sitting in church and playing Christian. And so he would never go with us. And then all of a sudden he's like, "I'm coming in and I want to go to church." And I thought, well, this is really promising. And I said, "Yeah, that would be great. I'm singing worship, but the kids will be sitting with the the children's pastor was a real good friend of mine, he and his wife, and they would always sit with my kids in the church service until it was time to take them to children's church." And I said, "So you'll come in, this is where they sit, and I'll come sit with you after worship time is over." And I saw him when he walked in, and it was a pretty large church. I would say there were probably 500 to 750 people. This was before mega churches, but it would be considered a mega church in today's society. But I saw him walk in, and the kids went on to children's church. And when I was done, I went and I sat with them and just sat the whole service. And then at the end, they did the altar call, and I had my head bowed, and I felt him get up, and he walked down the aisle, and he gave his life to Christ. And there are people who knew our story. There are people in my Bible study group who knew what I was going through. And to this day, even though we now know the end of the story is my marriage didn't survive, they would to this day say that was one of the biggest miracles they ever saw. And he gave his life to Christ. And I didn't let him come home right away. But I said, if you're willing to go to counseling, I'm willing to try and work this out. And he agreed to go to counseling. But counseling was going to be under his terms. He has said he wants to work it out. He's willing to go to counseling. He has some stipulations, but he didn't share them with me yet. So I don't let him move back home yet. I'm not there. So I make the appointment, let him know. He calls me the day before and he says, let me come pick you up. Let's ride together. And I said, sure, that sounds great. It was a 20-minute drive. He spent the entire 20 minutes telling me what I could and could not talk about. And you can bet your bottom dollar that the computer incident is what he started calling it, was off the table. And he told me exactly what he'd do if I talked about it. And I sat there going, really? But then I thought, oh, this woman's a professional. She's going to pull it. She's going to facilitate this conversation. And quick side note, in case you don't know my history, you haven't interacted with some of my other videos, I grew up in an alcoholic home. I was the eldest daughter. I was definitely groomed to be an enabler. I was the peacemaker in my home. My parents quit drinking when I was in college, but the path was already laid for me. I was in corporate America when I met my husband and got married. I was there until my daughter was born and she had some health concerns. The company was, she couldn't be in daycare and the company was downsizing, so I took a severance package. I was tough as nails at work, but at home, I got steamrolled over. I just wanted things to be peaceful. I just wanted to make it right. And that's the way I was at home. I was not strong at all back then, nothing like what I hope I am now. So he's telling me all this on the way to counseling, and I'm just praying that the counselor will see through this facade and get to the bottom of it. So the first session is just, why are you here? What are your goals? And kind of laid out some of the things that we wanted to work on in the marriage. And one of mine was work-life balance, because he worked for the airline, and when he wasn't with his airline job, he was at an Air Force base that wasn't in the town that we lived. It was like across the state. So he couldn't come home every day. He would stay in the BOQ there, and we just never saw him. We maybe saw him twice a week. And I said, so that's a problem for me. And he was way past his 21 years. He could definitely retire. He just didn't want to. Anyway, so that was kind of talked about. So he would come back on Sundays and go to church. He got involved in a Bible study, a men's Bible study group. And when he was in town on Saturdays, he would go have breakfast with them. And those wives of those husbands who were involved started befriending me and counseling me, helping me to get through my hard time. But the way they counseled me was, you're the wife. It's your job to keep your home and hearth together. You need to let your husband come home. You need to be more submissive. You need to set the example for him. It's your job as a wife. And I was like, no, I need this from him. And they said, no, you're going to cause him to stumble. He really needs you to be vulnerable and trusting of him. And I didn't know them very well, so I wasn't real receptive of it. But then my pastor started saying the same thing. And I felt like I was under a pressure cooker. And I let him come back before I was ready. I did. I really thought they convinced me I was doing the right thing. So fast forward about 2 months. And I can tell the counselor's starting to pick. She's starting to pick. She's digging. And one time she asked me a question, and I don't remember exactly what it was, and I didn't talk about the computer incident, but I did make reference to the fact that I knew that he had cheated and that he had this little life outside of our marriage. And he immediately jumps in and says, "Oh, I did what you wanted. I retired. I'm no longer in the Air National Guard." And she said, "Oh my gosh, that's huge." Totally distracted the whole thing of what I think was getting ready to be talked about. And I was in shock. Now, I don't know if he was actually retired at that point or he very quickly got it done, because he did present me with paperwork the next week that showed he retired. But as soon as she got done celebrating with him, I said, is there ever an instance where we can have a separate session? There's just some things I feel like I need to talk about that I'm not really comfortable talking about in front of him. Can we do that? And she said, well, yeah, how about next week I'll see you for 15 minutes and then see him for 15 minutes and then we'll come back together. I was like, perfect, great. All I need is 15 minutes. So the whole week he's calling me, what do you want to talk about? Why do you want to have a session on your own? What are you going to talk about? You're not going to talk about the computer incident, are you? And I said, there's just some things that I need to talk woman to woman. And I don't know why I couldn't be 100% honest with him. I'm sure there was a reason. But yeah, he calls me the day before, says, let's go together. I said, no, I'll meet you there. And then he was like, what are you going to do? You better not. And he starts telling me all the things he'll do to me and blah, 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 blah. And I get there and you bet. I word vomited all over her office about what had happened, the whole New Orleans thing, what led to me kicking him out of the house, to say she was shocked. She was like, I knew there was something. This is not what I thought it was going to be. And so she had me go not out to the waiting room where he was. She had me go into this little alcove office that was in the opposite direction. She called him in. The hallway had the several offices. They had those little machines that do the white noise. I could still hear him over that. I couldn't hear exactly what he was saying, but he was pissed and he left. He stormed out of there. And she said, he's getting straight on a plane and he's leaving. And she said, but I need you to be on the lookout. So he was gone for a while, but he came back the next Sunday and went to church and wanted to come home, wanted to talk, was willing to go back to counseling. And 2 weeks later, I found out I was pregnant because, I'd let him come back home. So I felt like I was stuck at that point. I didn't see a way. I had no money of my own. I wasn't making enough money in the work that I was doing from home. He controlled all the finances. Turns out nothing was in my name. And I had no family that lived near me yet. And the only people that I knew outside of my marriage was the church that was telling me I needed to stay married. Yeah. Okay, I just got home from work and I'm trying to get this out. I have a rehearsal to go to tonight and I think it'll be pretty late when I get back. So left you off with, I had told the counselor everything. Husband had stormed out, got on a plane, left town. Showed back up a couple days later, apologized for being so childish, really wanted to still work out the marriage. I was so on the fence, and then I found out I was pregnant. And I felt stuck. So that's where we are. I continued to go to counseling sessions for the next few weeks. He never showed up, and he always had a reason. Got stuck in weather delays, had to change trips, layovers didn't work out. He couldn't get on the plane in time to get back home. So I quit going too. And I am just surviving at this point. My first 2 pregnancies were dreams. I had very little morning sickness. This pregnancy, I didn't really have morning sickness. I would just be doing normal stuff and all of a sudden have to upchuck. And then I didn't ever feel sick, but I would throw up. I started carrying a throw-up bowl in my car and bags in my purse everywhere I went. At week 12, I woke up on the weekend and I was bleeding, not just spotting. I was full out bleeding. Think women menstrual cycle. That's what it was like. Woke up my husband and said, I think something's wrong. I need to go to the hospital. And he wouldn't take me. I don't even remember why, but I took myself to the hospital, to the emergency room. They did their ultrasounds. The attending doctor said, you have what's called a placental tear. You just need to go home, relax this weekend, take it easy, and call your doctor first thing Monday. It was pretty obvious he thought I was losing the baby. So I went home, did as he said, called my doctor on Monday. They got me in that afternoon. And surprisingly enough, when they did their ultrasound, it looked like the tear had started to heal itself. The placenta sac had attached back to the uterus wall, but I was still bleeding. There was still a tear, it just wasn't affecting the baby. So my doctor said, let's just kind of take a wait and see attitude. Everything was fine. The heartbeat was good. I didn't feel sick. I didn't feel like I was having any contractions. So she put me on bed rest for 2 weeks. During that 2 weeks, husband still went to work. He refused to take any time off work. There were a group of moms in our neighborhood. Our children were the same age, and we had become friends, acquaintances, I would say, because of our kids. And they totally stepped up. One of them came and got a key from me. And someone showed up at my house every morning. This was during the summer. My daughter was 4. My son was almost 8 when this happened. And someone would show up at my house at dawn, get the kids up, get them dressed, take them to their house, and they keep my children from sun up to sundown. And this happened every single day for 2 weeks. Every single day, someone from church, from that group that I was so resentful towards because they pressured me and made me feel like I needed to accept this man back into my home. They came every day. Someone came every day and brought me lunch and sat with me. Someone made sure that at least I had dinner, if not the entire family. My parents came. They lived out of town at the time, and they came every weekend for the 2 weekends that I was bedridden. I can't even tell you where husband was. He refused to sleep in the same bed with me because it was gross. And it was gross. It was a lot of blood, people. I was wearing adult diapers. It was gross. And he was disgusted. 2 weeks later, my mother took me back to the doctor, and the baby was still fine. And nothing was wrong with the baby, but I was still bleeding. And she presented me with an option. She said, this is going to be high risk for you. The baby's doing fine. The baby's getting everything he needs. They did testing. We now knew we had a boy. And she said, so I need you to think about whether or not you want to terminate the pregnancy, because there's a chance that you would die. My mother wanted me to terminate the pregnancy, and I said, I want some time to think about it. And just a side note, I'm so thankful that I had the opportunity to make the choice. Husband said, absolutely not. You're not terminating this pregnancy. And I said, well, the choice is not yours. But ultimately, I decided for me that I wanted to do whatever I could do to bring this baby into this world. And that meant that I was bedridden 100% until that baby was delivered. And so the next few months continued on with someone else taking care of my children every day, bringing them to me right before bedtime so they could climb in bed and we could snuggle until I could give them their goodnight story. Someone else tucked my children in every night. Again, I don't have any idea where my husband was this whole time. I have zero idea. My parents came every weekend. My church continued to bring meals. Our goal was to get to at least 24 weeks. Preferably more, but at least 24 weeks. That's what was considered a viable pregnancy. At the end of week 23, it was Saturday, August 8th, 1997. No, it was August 9th. It was August 9th, 1997. And I didn't feel good. That someone had brought the kids back and we were talking, and I said, I don't feel good. I just feel kind of odd. And she said, call the maternity ward. I'll stay here in case you need a ride. And I called them, and of course, husband was not home. He had taken 0 time off. I can't even say that enough. He took 0 time off. I called up to the hospital, and they said, are you having cramps? And I said, no. And they said, it doesn't sound like you're in labor. It's probably just best. We would send you home anyway. It's probably just best for you to rest comfortably in your home. So the neighbor went home. I remember I read for a while, and I fell asleep around 11 o'clock that night. And then I woke up. It was 12:30. I remember looking at the clock. It was 12:30. I woke up, and I had this need, to go to the bathroom. And I went into the bathroom, and as I squatted, Matthew was born. Hold on. I'm really trying to get this out. Okay, so Matthew was born. I wasn't where he could get the help he needed, and I just cradled him while he died. So I called my neighbor back, and she came and took me to the hospital, and her husband came and stayed in case the kids woke up. And she called my dad, who was out of town, lived in a different town. My mother was out of state at a conference. My dad met us at the hospital. And I'm going to stop this right here, and I'll continue. I'll post the next one right away, I promise. Oh, gosh. So thank you for your patience. I'm going to try and get through this. So go to the emergency room. My neighbor called my dad. He meets us there. Matthew's already passed, but he's still attached to me. They call my doctor. She has them go ahead and send me upstairs, and she's on her way. And they went ahead and she ordered blood. She knew I would need a transfusion, and they started prepping me for a DNC. Dr. Barkey told them not to disturb anything, leave the baby where he was. And as soon as she got there, she was going to move him and start the procedure. So the nurse was trying to put an IV in my arm, and for some reason she was having trouble. And she had jabbed me so many times, it frickin' hurt. And I'm sure I was dehydrated. But Dr. Barkey shows up, and she was a little pissed that the IV hadn't been started yet. And my dad was sitting right here at my shoulder. And Dr. Barkey goes ahead and starts getting prepped and keeps checking, you got that in, we got to get that transfusion in her, ready to go in her, blah, blah, blah. And Dr. Barkey gets between my legs, and I don't know what she did. I could feel something shift, and it was like this whoosh. And the last thing I remember saying was, I don't feel good. And it was the weirdest thing. I don't know that I would call it an out-of-body experience. It got noisy. Like, things were beeping, people were running around. That nurse is trying to jab a knife, oh my gosh, a needle in me. I don't remember if they ushered my dad out or not. But I feel like I'm sitting halfway up on the table, and I can see the point of view of my body. It is convulsing and thrashing, but I felt no pain. I just felt cold. I was so cold, but I had no pain. I had no feeling. I remember looking at this body thinking that looks like it hurt. And then the doctor grabs the big needle for the transfusion, and she says, F this, and she just plunges it in the artery of my neck, and my body just went, and I remember seeing it, but I had no pain. The nurse finally gets the IV in, and as soon as I start to drift off, I'm feeling like I'm in the warmest bathtub ever, and I'm just floating, and I remember having that conscious thought of, I just want to float away. I think I'm done. I remember having that thought. And again, they must have sent my dad out when things went haywire. But the next thing I know is I hear a male voice say my children's name in my ear. And it was like all of a sudden I was there. I was in pain. It was not even a minute before the sedation went on. They'd already started the DNC because I heard the doctor say we can't wait on sedation. And I was in so much pain. And the last thing I remember is thinking of my kids. I woke up later in a hospital room, and my dad was there. He got my mom on the phone, and I talked to her. It was very tearful. And what I didn't know at the time, my parents never told me this. They didn't tell me until I filed for divorce in 2012. So there you go. Go crazy on what an idiot I was. There's more to that story, obviously. But it took my parents 48 hours to track down my husband. He was not where he was supposed to be. They didn't tell me that till almost 15 years later. There was an obvious shift in how they treated him. I knew that they didn't like him. After that, I just didn't know why. When he did finally show up 2 days later at the hospital, he was drunker than a skunk. And he thought everything was so flippin' hilarious. It was so inappropriate. I was in the hospital for 2 weeks, and I had 2 more blood transfusions before they sent me home. And I remember the day they discharged me. Husband came and picked me up, took me home. I went back to the bedroom. He went off somewhere else in the house, and I went into the bathroom and was putting some things away, and I was going to get cleaned up. And I walked back into the bedroom, and there was just something about the light of the day and how it was lighting up the room. It just brought back a rush of memories of the last 3 months and everything I'd gone through trying to save this child who ended up not surviving. And I started ugly crying right there in the middle of the room. And I must have been wailing, I don't know, because husband comes running down the hallway. But as soon as he realized I was crying, the look on his face, I'll never forget it. It was the biggest look of disgust. And I remember stopping cold. And he comes up to me and he says, how long is this going to happen? I just need to know, how long is this going to happen? Because it's been 2 weeks. You need to just get over it. And he turns around and walks out. And right before he leaves the room, he turns around and says, and tell those church people to quit bringing us food. We're not a charity case. Just left off why I stayed the additional 15 years and the choice I had made. And now let's talk about what made me pivot. So I filed for divorce in spring of 2012, which was at least 9 months before I had planned to. In December of 2011, I was in a Hallmark store in my town. I was looking at the ornaments, and this woman comes up to me and starts talking to me and finally introduces herself. Turns out that she is the spouse of a previous Air Force fly buddy of husband's. And so we just do some catching up, talk about our families. And then she says, you know, it's probably not my business, but I'm just wondering why you're holding on to your marriage so tightly. And she said, you know, he and X, and she names a woman, are in love. He's bought her a ring. He's asked you for the divorce. I don't know why you won't give it to him. And I don't know what my face said to her in that moment, but what I said to her was, you're right. It's not your business. And I turned around and I walked off. I was shook because I was like, okay, well, now we're out in the community. There's stories going around that he's asked for a divorce and I don't want it. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? A few nights later, he's home and he's got his guns out. He's been collecting guns for several years at this point. He's got his guns out in the living room and he's watching TV and he's drinking a scotch and he's cleaning his guns. I'm sitting across the room reading a book. I don't remember if our daughter was home or not, but he's just casually cleaning the guns. And then he says, you know, what would happen if like one of these went off accidentally? And I looked up and I said, they're not loaded, right? You're not cleaning them loaded. And he goes, well, like if it accidentally shot you, what do you think would happen? And I'll be honest, I don't remember if I said anything or if I just got up and left the room. But the next morning, I called up to the church and asked for a meeting with one of the clergy. Yes, I was still at that church, but not for long. So I go into this meeting and I explain the situation. I explain the other woman. He's bought a ring. He's telling people that I won't give him a divorce. And then he asked me this really odd, inappropriate question while he was cleaning the guns. And the clergy said to me, what are you doing to connect to your husband? And I said, what do you mean? Well, he's the head of the home. And just if he were Jesus asking to spend time with you, what are you doing to facilitate him feeling like the head of the household? And I said, I'm fearful for my life here. And oh my God, the clergy said, I don't know why you're worried. You're saved. Even if he kills you, your eternity is assured. I picked up my bag and left, and I never went back to that church. That was the second thing. Third thing, this one happened right after the first of the year. I mean, I do feel like there was some divine intervention that was kind of dropping these things in my lap. Like, could it have been any more clear? But we had, from day one in our relationship, we had invested in real estate. And I was in charge of the real estate. I paid all the bills. I made sure the maintenance was done in the homes. I did all the contracts and rental contracts, everything. Anyway, it was just after the first of the month. I had written all of the payments on the mortgages. And about 2 weeks later, I get a very official looking letter from one of the mortgage companies. And I open it and it says, it has the check that I sent. And the letter states that now that you've declared bankruptcy, we can no longer accept payment directly from you. You need to go through the trustee. And I immediately called them and said, there must be some mistake. That I'm not claiming bankruptcy. So they emailed me the letter that they received from an attorney. And it was an attorney in my town. So I called that attorney, and as soon as I identified myself, the attorney said, oh my goodness, wife, I usually meet the wife before we file for bankruptcy, but I just need to assure you that your assets are just fine. You won't lose that. You won't lose your house. You'll each be able to keep your car for work purposes, and we're going to work this out. It'll be fine. And I said, well, you haven't heard from me because this is the first time hearing about this. And there was an immediate silence on the attorney's end. And he said, I think you probably have a conversation to have with your spouse. I said, oh, absolutely, I do. Sorry, my dog needed something. So I immediately got off the phone and went into the husband's office. And I started going through everything. And he's a hoarder, and there was paperwork everywhere. And let me see if I can remember the list of the things I found. The first thing I found was stuffed in the back of a drawer was at least 8 years of tax returns that I had taken and had prepared. The accountant was a friend of mine. I would take our taxes, have them prepared. She would call me. I would go pick them up. I would sign for them. I would bring them back home. We would have a whole talk about it. I would sign my name. He would sign his name, tell me he was going to do the check because we always owed money, and he was going to mail them the next day. I found all those tax returns, and there were 8 years that I found in that drawer. So he had not paid taxes for 8 years. The next thing I found was at the back of another drawer were multiple credit cards in my name. I had one credit card, one joint credit card that I had in my purse. And as far as I knew, it was the only credit card we owned. But no, there were lots of credit cards in my name. I even found a couple in the kids' names. I found the receipt for the ring. It was not a cheap ring. I found a receipt from In the Air Force, every Air Force base has a BX, base exchange, and they have a credit card system. It's an AFES credit card. I found a receipt for an AFES credit card that was about 5 years old, and all of the items that were purchased on this transaction was a crib, a changing table, bottles, baby clothes, baby blankets, baby paraphernalia. And at the time the purchase was made, my children were 10 years and older. They actually were teenagers at that point. So I was like, okay. Is there a random family somewhere? What else did I find? Paperwork that showed several default judgments against us for bad business decisions that he had gotten into. And the last thing I found was two things. Notification from the IRS that they were levying over $100,000 debt in unpaid taxes, penalties, and late fees. And then the second notice was they had been garnishing his wages for 4 months by the time I found all the paperwork. My first phone call was to the IRS. Explained the situation to them, talked at length to somebody. They told me exactly what I needed to do if I chose to call an attorney to declare myself as innocent spouse, because I definitely qualified. And my next phone call was to an attorney. Guess what? I'm hoping that this will be the last video that kind of ties up the story time we've all been invested in. I do plan to do a wrap-up video tomorrow just to answer some questions that so many of you have asked. But left off on the last video where all of this stuff had happened in a matter of weeks and I had made the decision to talk to an attorney. I did call an attorney and kind of consulted, and they just said, talk to your husband first and then call us back. So when the husband, not that they wanted me to wait, but they thought it would be interesting to see what his reaction to everything was. So when he returned home, I had everything that I had been told and what I had found. He denied any type of affair. He told me that he did not know that woman. He did admit to chatting online with her, so I don't know how he didn't know her. I think he meant in maybe the biblical sense. He said he had not given a ring to any other woman. I asked him about the bankruptcy, and he told me that everything he was doing was to protect me. And if I didn't trust him, then I didn't love him enough. I asked about the IRS. I asked about the summary judgments, and he just kind of shut down. He just kept saying, if you don't trust me, you don't love me. I told him that if he wasn't willing to talk to me and be honest with me, then I felt like I had no other choice but to seek the counsel of an attorney. And his response was, do what you think you have to do. So the very next day, I called the attorney in front of him. He knew I was making an appointment. And I saw the attorney a couple days later. Husband was still in town. Got home from so basically what the attorney told me was, even if you're not planning to actually get divorced, based upon what you're telling me and that he's not willing to talk to you about the finances, you've got to file to draw the line in the sand. And what they meant by that was that once you file and then the month later you go to your temporary order hearing, then the judge instructs both parties that you cannot make any changes in the financial status of your marriage without talking to your partner. And if you do, then you will be in contempt of court. So the attorney said you really do need to draw that line in the sand. Got home from that meeting, and he wanted to know how everything went. So I told him, and I told him exactly what the attorney said. And his response again was, do what you think you got to do. So I did what I thought was the best. And I went back to the attorney and I said, let's do it. We wrote everything up. The only thing I was wanting to be just like 100% upfront, nothing secret. I don't think that gets anybody anywhere. If I'm going to say anything, I won't say anything behind your back. I'm going to tell you something to your face. I will not ever talk behind your back. And I felt that way about this whole process. The only thing the attorney thought I should keep quiet about was the day that we would actually file and when he would be served. And the reasoning behind that was because he had spent the entire marriage telling me that if I left him or when he threatened to divorce me, he would leave me with nothing. He would leave me destitute. And so the attorney said, you need to be able to have the opportunity to go to your joint checking account the morning of and pull out half of whatever's there. It's a 50-50 state. And I did agree with that because of the threats that he had made in the past. So that's exactly what happened. The attorney told me when it would be filed and when he would be served. I stopped at the bank on the way to work that day and I withdrew half of what was in the account. He was served later that day, and I was in class, I had students, and the second he got served, the attorney didn't even need to tell me because husband started blowing up my phone, trying to call me, texting me, threatening to come up to the school. I finally grabbed the phone out of my drawer and said, I have students, don't come up here, you won't be allowed in. I will call you when class is over, we'll get together and we'll talk. And so we did. We got together and we talked, and he just, I love you, I don't want you to do this, at first. And then when I said, you've left me with no other choice, he got angry, told me what an embarrassment I made of him because he was served at home and maybe the neighbors saw. And then he went on and on about how I stole half of his money. So that didn't go very well. When I moved out, again, I took nothing except for my personal belongings and things I brought into the marriage. I didn't take any furniture. I bought an old cheap couch, a cheap bed, a card table for my kitchen, and I moved into the house that I'm in currently, and I have just slowly bought the things I need for the house, and I've made it a home and a very wonderful spot for me. But I took nothing from the marital home. A lot of it was just too many bad memories. But also, I just didn't want him. I knew that he was going to be vindictive, and I didn't want him to have any ammo against me, that I took everything from him. So the divorce actually took 5.5 years, which is ridiculous. But let me tell you the things that happened that put us in that situation. He continued to love bomb me. Thank goodness I had a wonderful counselor, and she identified him as a narcissist right away and really taught me what a narcissist was. I honestly had no clue. I don't know how I could have been so naive. And she held my feet to the fire and held me accountable and kept me on the path that I needed to be on that was best for me. Before the temporary hearing happened, the temporary order, he cleaned out both kids' college funds, told them they had to pay for their own college. He went into our joint 401k and transferred half of the money. And when he showed up for the temporary hearing, he claimed that I needed to pay for half of my daughter's college. And then he claimed that the money that he was showing was the balance of the 401k was all that I was entitled to for 50%, because we're a 50-50 country state. Thankfully, my attorney had already gotten the bankruptcy paperwork, the filing, and it showed the original balance of the 401k. So that was entered into court as the evidence, and the judge would make judgment based upon that. Then he went on this cycle of switching attorneys. Every time we had a court date, he would switch attorneys, and every court date got continued because the new attorney had to get on board. That happened for about 2 years before the judge kindly kiboshed that. So once he didn't have that avenue anymore, the next thing that happened is he was sick. He had double pneumonia because my daughter told me about it. But after the double pneumonia, he called me and told me he had lung cancer. He had just been to the doctor and had been diagnosed with lung cancer. That's why he got the double pneumonia. And that the divorce was too stressful for him, and he really needed me to stay the proceedings for 6 months so he could get healthy. And I thought, okay, is he really sick? Maybe he is. And I gave him the benefit of the doubt at that point because he had been sick. And I asked my attorney to hold off for 6 months. Yeah, I'm sorry. I have to do another part. I'm almost done. I promise. I'll post the next one immediately. Really, really fast to talk. Faster. So he's told me he has lung cancer, asked me to stay proceedings. I did. I gave him the benefit of the doubt because I knew he had had double pneumonia and been in the hospital for quite some time. So he used that to his advantage, and near the end of the 6 months, tried to have the divorce petition dismissed because of lack of action. Thank goodness my attorney caught it and we got that stopped. The next thing he tried to do was use my mental status against me, how I was after Matthew passed. It was despicable. What else? Oh, he stalked me. He stalked me to the point that my attorney filed a harassment order against him. About a week after the harassment order was filed and he was served, I was home by myself. I don't remember where my daughter was, because it was during summer break and she was home. She was with me, but the dog that I had at that time was a little dog and she didn't bark, but if she was ever anxious or worried, she would nudge me awake. And 2:30 one morning, she nudged me awake and she kept like running out of the bedroom and then coming back and making sure I was following her. And I walked out of the bedroom, and when you come down the bedroom hall and into the living area, you can see out. There's this big picture window that looks out to the back deck and the backyard. And when husband had been harassing me and showing up at my house at all times of the evening and nights, I had put cameras and floodlights out at my house. And so as I'm coming out and I'm trying to see out that huge picture window and it's pitch black out there, all of a sudden I saw like 2 flashlights kind of traveling around the corner of the house. And as soon as whoever it was rounded the corner, the floodlight came on and there were 2 what looked like men out there. I didn't stay to look to see what was happening any further. I ran back to my bedroom. I got my phone. I dialed 911 and I got my protection that I keep in a safe by my bed. And I came back out to the window or around the corner so I could see out the window, and they weren't there anymore, but the floodlight was still on. So I just waited for a few minutes. The police took less than 5 minutes. They've been out to my house several times at this point. So the police got there within 5 minutes, and there was no one there. They checked the house. They checked the backyard. There were footprints, and the side of my house doesn't grow grass, so you could see the footprints, shuffle prints across there. And so they said, check your cameras and call us tomorrow. So I did check my cameras. It turned out there was a white truck. It parked in front of my driveway. So if I had tried to get out of my driveway and escape, I wouldn't have been able to. And there was 20 minutes of motion sensor on my front camera. I have one that sees out up the driveway and one that sees out the front door and the whole street in front of my house. And every few minutes, they look like men, one of the guys would get out of the truck, and over my front door, I have this arched window. And the front bedroom of my house, that big front window has a fancy arched window also. That's actually my guest room. But one of the guys, they wore a mask that covered the bottom of their face. Again, this was during the summer. They wore a mask that covered the bottom of their face, and they both had ball caps on. One of them would come up and they would shine their flashlight over the arch window over the door, and then they would go and shine the flashlight over the arch window of the bedroom, like they were trying to see if anyone would react. And then they'd go back in the truck and they would just sit there. And you could tell the truck was on too. It was idling. But then, and again, I'm watching this video after the fact, and they did that about 5 times. And then they finally both got out, turned the truck off, got out of the truck and came and they crossed my driveway. The next camera I have looks up the side yard towards the front, and they both climbed over my 6-foot privacy fence that's locked and came up with their flashlights up the side of my house. There's one still shot I was able to make that showed them pretty clearly. I posted it all over Facebook, all over the next door neighbor app, and no one could identify who they were. But they came up, and that's when they came around the corner and caught the floodlight. I have 2 cameras that crisscross the whole view of my backyard, and they were caught on the first camera as they came around the corner, and you can see when the floodlight went on, they, both jerked and turned around and ran. They were never caught on the second camera. There's no proof that had anything to do with anything about my husband, but it was pretty circumstantial, and it did scare me quite a bit. He took mail from my mailbox and started harassing anyone who wrote me a letter. There was an old friend from high school who wrote me quite a bit. It was my boyfriend from high school, and we'd stayed in touch all these years. And at one point, he did write me a letter that I never saw. He did tell me what it ended up having in it was he told me everything he wished he had told me back in 1985 when we broke up, which was 3 years before I met my soon-to-be ex-husband. The last thing he did was we finally had mediation scheduled. And people, if you are going through a divorce, I don't care if it's amicable or not, you should try to settle in mediation. Mediation cannot be appealed. If the judge is the one who makes your divorce settlement, if your spouse is not happy with the settlement, they can appeal it until the dogs come home and keep you tied up in court for years. So we had mediation scheduled, and my attorney and I had already talked about what the magic number was that we were going to settle at. And honestly, it was below 50%. I just wanted out. But the week before mediation, my daughter had come home for the week I think it was fall break. No, it wasn't. Sorry. She had just come home. I remember she was somewhere. She was doing a internship that summer. She came home for the 4th of July weekend. So we had lunch, and husband came to lunch with us, and my cousin was there, and we had a great time. And he was so nice and pleasant to be around. It was really kind of weird because he had not been all this time. But we left and came back to my house, and my daughter went with him. And it was probably 20 minutes. We were walking in the house, my cousin and I, and he called me. And so I usually let his phone calls and text messages go unanswered because they were usually not very nice. But because we just had this great lunch, I answered it, and I had him on speaker, and I said, "Hey, you're on speaker and cousin's here." And he just went right into, "This is the way it's going to be. You will settle for this amount," which was the original quarter that he wanted me to settle for at day one, "or I'm going to get you fired from your job." And I said, "What do you mean get me fired?" And he said, "I'll call them and tell them that you do drugs." And I laughed because I was like, "I don't do drugs. You're the one that smokes pot. What are you talking about?" And he said, "They don't know that. And it's such a straight-laced district, and they'll just be so embarrassed that someone is accused of, and I'll call the news outlets, and I'm going to get you fired." And I just said, "I'm hanging up now." And I hung up the phone, called my principal, and said, "Hey, sorry to disturb your summer, but just so you know, this is what happened." And the principal said, "Don't worry, we got your back. We know you. We've dealt with crazy exes before." And he did. He called the district. Whatever. But despite all that, I had a bulldog of an attorney. We had 10 hours of mediation. Again, I settled for less than 50%. It was closer to 40%, but I just needed to be out from that situation. So my cautionary tale for any of you who are looking at getting married is be very, very careful about who you choose. And especially be careful about who you choose to have a family with. Because if it goes downhill, you are tied to them for the rest of your life. Yeah. So I have been 7 years divorced now. I have built myself a great little life. I am at so much peace. And I will do a wrap-up video that answers all of the questions that you've been asking about, am I single? What's the relationship that my kids have with their dad? Why did my parents keep what they had found out a secret? And what was my accountability or part in the divorce? And I'll answer questions about the church too. So talk to you soon. Now I'm going to try really, really fast to talk, faster. So he's told me he has lung cancer, asked me to stay proceedings. I did. I gave him the benefit of the doubt because I knew he had had double pneumonia and been in the hospital for quite some time. So he used